It's time to eat.
What are you hungry for?
Sit down and get ready to consume an abundance of fantasy football knowledge from Ross Tucker and Joe Dolan.
Feed me now. I'm starving.
On the Fantasy Feast Eatin' Podcast.
Yeah, let's eat, baby. It is the Fantasy Feast Eatin' Podcast, presented, of course, by DraftKings. I'm Ross Tucker, former NFL offensive lineman, 5 teams, 7 years. Bunch of media gigs, boatload of podcasts. Michael Giannitti from Spa Track was awesome on today's Ross Tucker football podcast. Really interesting looking at the quarterback contract conundrums this offseason, whether it's guys like Russell Wilson and Stafford or Geno Smith, Daniel Jones. Encourage you to check that out. You can check me out on social at Ross Tucker NFL. We are at Ross Tucker Pod. By the way, Ross Tucker Pod has a Facebook page. For those of you that are on Facebook, that's awesome. I don't really post clips very often on my Facebook page, so it's nice that we have an official Facebook page of the show now, Ross Tucker Pod, which is awesome. Almost as awesome as Joe Dolan, who is the premier fantasy analyst out there. Google it. Just Google fantasy analyst rankings over the last 5 years, 10 years, doesn't matter. At FG_Dolan is his social handle. He's one of the studs over at fantasypoints.com, where you can and should use the code 22FEAST to get a discount. Hey, maybe you get a head start on the draft. Maybe you just want to cram this week because you're in the championship, Joe. A lot of people having their championships this week.
You should be.
Weird week. Let's start with Thursday night. Cowboys against the Titans, who have literally nothing to play for, the Tennessee Titans in this
Correct.
game.
And Derrick Henry's dealing with a hip injury. So here's the deal with the Titans. If you're a fantasy player, you've probably already heard this, by the way. But if you're a fantasy player, it needs to be reiterated. It doesn't matter if the Titans win this game by 100. It doesn't matter if they lose this game by 100. They still need to beat the Jaguars next week to win the AFC South. So my question is, if Derrick Henry's banged up, why would they play him this week? Maybe he does. He practiced in a limited fashion. He said, whatever we do, I'll be ready. I don't know if he's going to play. I don't know if maybe he goes out and he gets 5 carries just to stay fresh, and then they take him out of the game. I would not be counting on Derrick Henry if I have him in my fantasy championship. And unfortunately, that's just the way the ball bounces on some of these things. Next week is going to be potentially chaos, Ross. Figuring out all the playoff scenarios in your head right now, probably a futile exercise, but the one thing we do know is the Titans have nothing to play for this week. Next week is for all the marbles, the whole schmear. This week, no. Dallas is a 10-point favorite, and it's probably not enough. The question just becomes, how much does Dallas need to play in this one? Dallas is, I know they had the big win, but it's almost certainly locked into the 5 seed in the NFC. The Eagles, by the way, and we'll get to them, they have to win one of their final 2 games, and they might get a Giants team in Week 18 that has literally nothing to play for. We'll talk about that later. But the Cowboys, look, Tennessee's a pass funnel defense. We know that. I would expect CeeDee Lamb to come in, get some work done, and then maybe ride off into the sunset in this game.
Arizona is at Atlanta. I haven't even seen her. Are we going to get McSorley again, or is Colt McCoy back?
We'll probably learn more today. But if you have DeAndre Hopkins in your fantasy championship, good Lord, Lori, do you need Colt McCoy back? 10 targets, 1 catch, 4 yards for DeAndre Hopkins in that game. Oh, my Lanta. And here's the other problem. Even if Colt McCoy plays in this game, DeAndre Hopkins could catch a shadow from A.J. Terrell. Well, our guys at Fantasy Points Data do chart these things. And A.J. Terrell is a shadow corner. He will shadow receivers. There's only a handful of them in the NFL these days, but he will do it. Since Michael Thomas in Week 1, remember Michael Thomas? He put 2 touchdowns on A.J. Terrell in Week 1. The young corner since then has shadowed 5 different receivers per Fantasy Points Data at a clip of 68% of their routes or higher. DK Metcalf, who had 2 catches for 19 yards on 8 targets in his coverage. Amari Cooper, who had 1 catch for 9 yards on 3 targets in his coverage. Mike Evans, who had 4 catches for 81 yards on 6 targets in his coverage. Terry McLaurin, who had 1 catch for 3 yards on 2 targets in his coverage. And Chris Olave, who had no catches on 1 target in AJ Terrell's coverage. Terrell has almost entirely shut down his shadows this year. Trace McSorley shut DeAndre Hopkins down last week. So that's a potential problem. If McSorley plays, I think we're lighting the Dortch torch, Ross. Dortch just continues to produce whenever he gets opportunities to play. That would be a huge, huge factor if indeed Trace McSorley has to play, and maybe even if Colt McCoy plays in this game.
Wow. Interesting. What about Atlanta on offense?
Oh, they stink. Tyler Algier is probably the most interesting guy here. Atlanta, who did they even play last week? That was one of those are one of those teams that has kind of just completely gone out of my mind. Oh, they played the Ravens last week. Tyler Algier continues to be their lead back. He even added 4 for 43 receiving in that game, which was surprising. Arthur Smith talking up Tyler Algier. I love the way he finishes runs. And at the very least, Desmond Ridder looked like he somewhat belonged in that game. And Drake London has been their best receiver under Desmond Ridder. He had 7 catches for 96 yards against the Ravens. So Drake London's on the wide receiver 3 radar. Although he hasn't really for teams that have advanced to the championship, if they have Drake London on him, he's probably been riding the pine for much of the time.
What about as we get to Chicago and Detroit? Chicago says they're playing their guys.
Yeah, I mean, give Justin Fields a little bit more time, a little bit more experience. By the way, the total in this game, 52. It's the highest on the slate. The key for Detroit here is to watch the situation with their backfield. Jamal Williams got dinged up late in the game last week in that embarrassing loss to the Panthers. And there is a possibility that Jamal Williams can't go this week. So does it become a blow-up spot for DeAndre Swift? This is a Bear defense that hemorrhaged fantasy points last week to the Buffalo running backs. Devin Singletary ran for over 100 yards and a touchdown. James Cook ran for 99 yards and a touchdown. So this is a potential DeAndre Swift championship blow-up spot, especially if Jamal Williams can't play. Now, if Jamal Williams doesn't go, do I expect Justin Jackson to be involved? Of course I do. Maybe he's a wing and a prayer type of guy, but that is a situation to monitor. And with this total at 52, there are going to be a lot, and I mean a lot, of fantasy championship teams, Ross. And this is always, going back, look, Jalen Hurts, Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, these kind of guys have indeed at points. Lamar Jackson broken the quarterback position for fantasy. But there will always be 2 or 3 guys a year who you could pick up off the waiver wire. There are going to be a ton of fantasy championship teams that have Jared Goff on them. A ton. Ross, Lamar Jackson could well play this week, okay? In my dynasty league, our fantasy points staff dynasty, last year, Dolan foolishly traded 2 first-round picks for Lamar Jackson in that league. I thought it was the final piece to put me over the top. Even if Lamar Jackson plays this week, I'm starting Jared Goff over him. Even if he plays this week, I'm going with the guy who's got the matchup, who's got the recent run of form. I'm playing Jared Goff for my fantasy championships, and I expect him to do well.
I don't expect, by the way, Lamar Jackson to play. We'll see.
Even if he does play, I'm starting Goff. So it's moot for me at that point.
Chicago offensively, Joe?
Justin Fields, David Montgomery. I mean, Fields. So if Fields isn't running, you're getting nothing out of him. He was terrible against the Bills. They have no weapons whatsoever. Ross, I know, and this is just going to something that you look to offseason mode at this point. The Bears are currently surrendering the 33rd pick in the draft for Chase Claypool.
Yeah, I know.
Who's given them nothing. And is in the final year of his rookie contract next year.
Brutal.
I mean, That very well could be. I mean, they have a shot to be the worst team in the league this year. That could be the 32nd pick in the draft, giving up essentially a first-round pick for Chase Claypool. Yikes. I know we criticized Ryan Poles this offseason, and he had a lot of work to do, okay? I'm not saying he should be fired. I know we criticized him this offseason for saying they didn't get Justin Fields weapons. But, not like that, man. Not like that. Trade like a 5th-round pick for, Zach Pascal or something. Would have been a lot better. Just a brutal trade. Justin Fields, you play him. Look, this total is super high. And David Montgomery, Khalil Herbert, the Lions, who had been absolutely shutting down run games, got embarrassed by the Panthers last week. Ross, did you see that tape? What happened to them?
Totally dominated. I tell you what, the Panthers have some good run blockers. They're like tight end fullback dude. Tommy Tremble is a stud. Iquanu still needs a little work in pass protection, but he's a difference maker as a run blocker. It's pretty awesome, actually, unless you wanted the Lions to win.
Do you remember what Greg Cosell said about Tommy Tremble? But I know this is a fantasy podcast. Do you remember what he said about Tommy Tremble when he came out of Notre Dame?
It was something funny, but I forget.
It was like, as a blocker, he looks to melt the face mask of the guy he's blocking.
Yeah.
It looks like it's working out for Carolina. Anyway, that's what happened to the Lions. They Ross, the scientific term is they got their asses kicked physically by the Carolina Panthers. I don't know if the Bears have that capability, but I'm willing to start David Montgomery in case they do.
Here's a wild game, Joe. The Jaguars, for whom the game doesn't matter, against the Texans, who likely don't want to win another game and lose the number 1 overall pick. Strange game, Jags, Texans. Although I'm sure Doug Peterson wants a winning record, wants to win.
Let me throw this out there. First and foremost, don't tell Davis Mills to lose this game. Hey, Davis, help us get Bryce Young. No, guys, no. I don't want to help you get Bryce Young. So Ross, there's a hit on 16 3 times and get to 21 scenario for the Jaguars. And let me lay it out to you. If the Jaguars win this week, Miami loses out. The Jets need to lose this week, but beat Miami in week 18. The Steelers need to lose once, and the Patriots need to win this week, but lose in week 18 against the Bills. The Jaguars can get in as a wild card, even if they lose to the Titans next week. So there needs to be again, hit on 16 3 times and get 2 2s and an ace, and they can get in. I'm not sure that that's highly likely, but they can still happen. It can still happen. So if I had to guess, I guess the Jaguars would play to win in this game. The problem for the Jaguars is earlier this season, now this was back in week 5, and Trevor Lawrence was not even playing the same sport in week 5 as he's playing right now. So please take that with a grain of salt. But the Texan defense against the pass has been legitimately good. It can be argued that Lawrence played his worst game of the season back in week 5. He threw a couple of picks against the Texans in an embarrassing loss. The Jaguars lost to the Texans earlier this year. And in that game, Zay Jones and Christian Kirk combined for 3 catches for 23 yards on 11 targets. So that's again, October, Trevor Lawrence wasn't even playing the same sport that he's playing right now. Just something to note about this matchup. It is a tough draw for those for those Jaguar wide receivers.
Houston?
Forget about the backfield. The only player you can even consider in this matchup is Brandon Cooks, who is probably looking to throw some decent tape out there, maybe for a team to trade for him this offseason. That's it. Houston's almost entirely a cross-off team for me.
Let's go to Denver at Kansas City.
Speaking of cross-off teams for me, at the very least, Jerry Jeudy is really starting to come on as Russell Wilson's guy. But, I mean, maybe Denver gets the post-coach firing bump here. But in a season of terrible performances, Russell Wilson's coming off his worst, in my opinion. He was so bad on Christmas. I mean, it's just totally broken at this point. I mean, bad in Cortland Sutton's showing him up on the field. You've got offensive linemen fighting the backup quarterback. Ross, did that ever happen to you? The
I
backup?
don't remember that being the backup quarterback. No.
No. I mean that if the starting quarterback comes over, I'm sure you've gotten a word or two from a starting quarterback at some point.
Yes.
Mhm.
I've just never seen the backup like that where it like got heated. I would love to know what that exchange was.
I mean, it's Brett Rippon sticking up for a guy in his room, and I mean, it shows you all the dysfunction. And in ways, I feel bad for Nathaniel Hackett. Like Andrew Brandis said, Hackett was very clearly hired with the intention of bringing Aaron Rodgers to town. And I know Rodgers has had his struggles this year, but he still looks like a functional NFL quarterback, which is more than we can say about Wilson at this stage. But look, Denver's a 13-point underdog in this game. A couple weeks ago, Wilson might have played his best game of the season. And still they couldn't get it done against the Chiefs. Like for the Broncos, I mean, Latavius Murray played his lowest snap share in weeks last week. He was coming into the game hurt. They got their butts whipped. So obviously Latavius Murray is working in and out of the lineup. Cortland Sutton's a wide receiver 4. Dulcich got a touchdown. Yay. He's like a low-end tight end streamer for me. Jerry Jeudy's kind of a must start for me. Just because he's finally started to show some signs of life here. But otherwise, Denver is a team that 13-point underdog in week 17, kind of a cross-off team for me.
Kansas City?
So Kansas City, the thing about the Chiefs here is the last time these two teams played, the Broncos defense did have Mahomes on the ropes. I mean, he threw for 352 and 3 touchdowns, but he also chucked 3 picks. And if not for Jalen Hurts getting injured, that might have been the game that kind of wrapped up the MVP. Now Mahomes is once again the heavy favorite, and justifiably so. But of Patrick Mahomes' 28 completions in that game, only 11 went to wide receivers. Juju Smith-Schuster had 9 of them. So really, that's the only wide receiver I think you can consider in this matchup for them. Obviously, you're playing Kelsey. And Jerick McKinnon, though his run as the overall RB1 ended last week, he still got in the box. He had over 100 receiving yards against the Broncos the last time out. I'm still going back to the well on Jerick McKinnon in this matchup.
Dolphins are at the Patriots. I tend to doubt that we see Tua Tagovailoa, Joe.
I doubt we see Tua this week, and I don't know if we'll see him again this season. I mean, at some point, like, look, I understand all the hand-wringing about the NFL, oh, blah, 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 player safety, blah, blah. You know what else the NFL gives a crap about, maybe above all, is optics. What does it say if Tua now we come out and I was working out during the second half of that football game. I was getting a workout in. And my father-in-law was sitting on the couch, and I come out, and he said, I don't know what Tua was looking at. Like, he threw 3 bad interceptions, and he's like, this guy didn't look like a functional NFL quarterback. Then it turns out he was probably playing the second half with a concussion. I mean, I don't know how that can happen. And then the NFL is like, oh, all right, 3rd concussion this year. You know what? Let's throw him out there. I don't think it's going to happen. And I know Miami's season's on the line. Well, guess what? You probably have a much better shot of winning and not destroying somebody's life if Teddy Bridgewater's out there at quarterback. And look, Teddy is a certain kind of player. The one thing we do know is Teddy can put this ball in the hands in the short to intermediate area of Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle, and those guys can do their thing. You know, I'd much rather see Teddy out there than a concussed Tua, even from a fantasy perspective. Not most certainly from a human perspective, but even from a fantasy perspective, I'd rather see Teddy out there than Tua. The Dolphins are underdogs in this game against the Patriots. And then on the Patriots side of things, look, we just talked about the Russell Wilson deal with Brett Rippon coming over and yelling at the offensive line. Ross, is Mac Jones acting like a petulant child to you? Like, what is going on there? Like,
yeah, I don't know. I can't stand watching him.
I mean, he's first and foremost, he's been bad. Like, and maybe the offense is to blame. They don't have great receivers. The run game was non-existent against Cincinnati, as good as Ramondre Stevenson has been this year. I mean, this Patriots team is a tough watch. Ramondre Stevenson, you got to play him. I think Jacoby Myers is a viable wide receiver 3. The Dolphins secondary is pretty good. Their slot corner, Kader Kohu, I mean, what a find this young guy has been for them. But, I mean, if you bench every Patriot but Ramondre Stevenson, you're not going to get an argument from me.
Let's talk Colts Giants, Joe.
The Colts are in full-on tank mode here. Full-on tank mode. They're 6-point underdogs. Foles was terrible. I mean, I think you could put prime Peyton Manning in that offense and it still wouldn't function just the way things are going right now. The one thing we got about the Colts is Zach Moss is clearly their lead back now. I mean, he handled 12 of 13 running back carries in that game. He played 68% of the offensive snaps. And we do know that the Giants have been a great matchup. As a matter of fact, per fantasy points data, the Indianapolis Colts have the best run grade of the entire week. So I think Zach Moss is a viable play this week, and maybe Michael Pittman is a wide receiver 3. But the Indianapolis Colts, they are looking to get through this season, make a new coaching hire, draft a new quarterback, and head into the future. Although I don't know if Irsay wants the new quarterback to be that good, because Irsay wants to draft Arch Manning in 3 years. So let's hold it over for a couple of years, and then I guarantee you, barring them getting like Anthony Richardson and him turning into the new Cam Newton, I think Irsay's going to try everything to try to get Arch Manning in a Colts uniform in 3 years. That's just knowing the way Irsay works, I think that's pretty obvious. But for me, this is Zach Moss. This is Michael Pittman. Shut it down. Nick Foles is starting again. Nick Foles was not very good on Monday night against the Chargers. It goes without saying.
Giants?
Okay, so here is the situation that I was alluding to earlier. The Giants can clinch a playoff spot with this game. If they lock it in, they can't be the 5 seed. Dallas is pretty much, barring a Philly collapse, Dallas is pretty much locked into the 5 seed in the NFC. So the Giants can come out. They can do everything in this game. I know they have some injuries, but you do everything in your power. Oh, there go the girls. You do everything in your power if you're the Giants to win this game against a bad opponent, a team that you should beat. And then the Giants can clinch themselves a mini bye and rest everybody against Philadelphia next week. And I think that's what's going to happen. That's the most likely outcome here. It's a great matchup for Saquon Barkley. It is a glorious draw. And remember, a couple of weeks ago with Saquon Barkley, we're like, man, that neck injury, that could knock him out. And then all of a sudden, he's come back and he's had 2 great games. Week 16 against the Vikings, I mean, it wasn't Saquon's fault the Giants lost that game. He did everything he could. 14 carries, 84 yards. He had the long touchdown run. 8 catches and 49 yards receiving and 10 targets. It was the first time since week 8 of 2019 that Saquon had either 8 catches or 10 targets in a football game. So he is playing vintage Saquon football. And there is one more name that I want you to look at in this game. I think he is a viable starter this week. Barring the Colts rushing back slot cornerback Kenny Moore for no reason whatsoever. They also just put another starter, Isaiah Rodgers, on IR, by the way, with a foot injury. Richie James. James has 3 or more catches and 41 yards or more in 5 of his last 6 games. He has a touchdown in 3 of those contests. Last week, he had 8 catches for 90 yards in a glorious matchup with the Vikings. It gives him 13 or more fantasy points in 4 of his last 6 games. And since Kenny Moore went down, the Colts have been hemorrhaging production out of the slot. Over the last 2 games, they have allowed the 5th most fantasy points per game above season average to opposing slot receivers. Keenan Allen crushed them. You saw KJ Osborne crush them. I think Richie James has a big game in this one.
Let's move on to the Saints and the Eagles. Recording this Wednesday at 9:54 a.m. We do not know who the quarterback will be for the Philadelphia Eagles at this point.
Do you have a read on that situation?
I really don't.
I think it's going to be Hurts.
I mean, I know what I would do, but I don't know what they're going to do.
I'm going to say 60-40 it's Hurts right now. But Gardner
I
Minshew,
would go the opposite.
Okay. Gardner Minshew
I would say 60-40 Minshew just because of their I'm just thinking about the way they are in the preseason and stuff.
Yeah.
Like they're very
conservative,
I would say, with rest and health.
Yeah. So the complicating matter is obviously the fact that they still need to win a game. Organizationally, by the way, I sure as hell don't expect Jalen Hurts or Gardner Minshew to care about the fact that the Eagles had the Saints draft pick, and they shouldn't. That shouldn't be a motivating factor for the players. Organizationally, it matters to Howie Roseman. It matters to Jeffrey Lurie. The other complicating matter here is the absence of Lane Johnson. Lane Johnson, Ross, you well know, is the best right tackle in football. Hasn't given up a sack in over 2 years. The Saints don't have a great pass rush. It's functional. But the downgrade from Lane Johnson to Jack Driscoll, as solid a backup as Driscoll is sizable. They could, in theory, move Jordan Mailata to right tackle and play Andre Dillard at left. I don't know at this point if I'd do that and make two guys have two new spots on the offensive line.
That would surprise me.
It would surprise you? Yeah, it would surprise me too. But, I mean, obviously, Minshew was not the reason they lost that football game. They had some uncharacteristic mistakes. For some reason, they've been scheming up touches for Quez Watkins the last couple of weeks. Quez Watkins is a good player. He's a certain kind of player. He is not somebody you want to throw the ball to on 3rd and 5 in a contested catch situation across the middle. And I don't know why they've been kind of forcing these things. If you want to do that, put Zach Pascal in the game, because he's a bigger, more physical receiver. But we do know, look, the Saints, Marshawn Lattimore, I think that guy's been practicing for like 3 months and hasn't gotten on the football field. We'll see if he plays this week. Even if he does, he'll be rusty. Advantage A.J. Brown. And all of a sudden, to me, Devontae Smith looks like an alpha receiver. Like, that guy is freaking good. Like, I don't know what it's been the last couple weeks with, like, you know, through his first season and maybe a half, you're like, man, this guy's a really good receiver. But that, you know, really good receiver. Like, the last few weeks, that game against Dallas, he looked like a superstar wide receiver. Like, he is unbelievable. I don't know what you've seen from him, Ross.
Playing very, very well. There's no question.
They have two big-time receivers. Dallas Goedert is back. Miles Sanders had that bad fumble. Look, whether it's Hurts or Minshew, I expect the Eagles to get theirs. And if you have these guys, Goddard, A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, Hurts or Minshew, you got to start them. I mean, they're going to put up numbers offensively.
What about the Saints on offense, Joe?
Well, the Eagles now, I know like the Eagle defense. So Jonathan Gannon, the Eagles defensive coordinator, is not a very popular man in Philadelphia, and he never has been. I don't think giving up a 3rd and 30 is going to be exactly on his resume when he goes for head coaching interviews. But if there is one player on defense outside of like Darius Slay or Josh Sweat who the Eagles could least afford to lose against Dallas, it was Avonte Maddox, the slot corner, knowing CeeDee Lamb is Dallas's slot receiver. And Dallas very correctly went and picked on Josiah Scott, the backup slot corner. Lamb only had one catch in the second half, of course, but it was a touchdown. I think that the Eagle defense will be better this week, and we do well know that the Saints offense doesn't have, first and foremost, it doesn't have a quarterback as good as Dak Prescott. It sure as hell doesn't have a receiver as good as CeeDee Lamb. And that Eagle run defense, Alvin Kamara scoring his first touchdown since week like 8 in that game. But that Eagle run defense was the first run defense to hold Ezekiel Elliott and Tony Pollard under a combined 100 rushing yards since week 4. So that run defense has really shored up of late. I just think it's a bad matchup for the Saints. Rashid Shaheed, maybe you saw the Eagles give up a 3rd and 30 and you're like, well, I'm going to get a big play out of Rashid Shaheed. All right, sure, maybe. We still don't know the status of Chris Olave. We do know that their slot receiver, Jarvis Landry, is on IR, so I don't expect them to be able to take advantage of Josiah Scott the way that the Cowboys did last week.
Who do you think they'll put in the slot?
Oh, God. Let me, matter of fact, let me, I think it'll be Keith Kirkwood.
That'll be interesting.
I don't think anybody's going to be picking up Keith Kirkwood, Ross, for this week.
We can move on. Carolina, Tampa Bay is a really juicy game, actually. One of the best games of the day.
Yeah, Carolina whipped the Lions and their run defense, which had been elite, by the way. They're going to run the football. That's what they're going to do. the thing about Deontay Foreman that's been so frustrating, I said, by the way, on this podcast last week that I preferred Chuba Hubbard to Deontay Foreman straight up because of his role in the passing game. I did not expect the Lions' run defense to get as dominated as it did. Of course, both guys ran for over 100 yards. The thing that's frustrating about Deontay Foreman, though, is it seems like he runs for either 200 yards or 12 in a game. And there's no in between, and he does nothing in the passing game. So, obviously, there's... It's hard to trust them, but if you somehow manage to get through and you've got Deontay Foreman on your team, I don't blame you if you want to play him here in this game against the Buccaneers. I mean, I really don't blame you. Deontay Foreman, I have such a hard time getting a read on this guy because, again, he does nothing in the passing game. The last time he caught a pass was in Week 14. It was 1 catch for 1 yard. In his last 8 games, he has 3 catches for -1 yard. Against the Buccaneers earlier this year, though, he ran for 118 yards. So, yeah, start Deontay Foreman, start DJ Moore, and that's it. But Carolina still controls its own destiny, can get to the playoffs, I think you can make an argument that Carolina, with its defense and at least that running game, which is elite at times, might be actually a more dangerous out than Tampa in the playoffs, which is amazing to say.
What about Tampa, Joe?
Playoff Lenny says he's playing through a Liz Frank sprain, even though he hasn't been on the injury report. Ooh, that's kind of juicy. And let's see if the Bucs get any fine for that. Like, the thing about the Buccaneers, though, you can kind of play both of their running backs. Leonard Fournette, 9 catches for 90 yards, 72 yards on the ground. Rachaad White has 7 carries, but he catches 4 passes and scores a touchdown. Both of those guys are viable RB2s. Chris Godwin, 8 catches for 63 yards. He continues to be Tom Brady's guy. Mike Evans, though, has been one of the biggest disappointments in fantasy this year. Not sure how much Mike Evans will get done in this game. Now, of course, the big situation, though, and it is a huge loss for the Carolina Panthers, is the loss of cornerback J.C. Horn. And that's going to make, by the way, he plays everywhere. J.C. Horn plays inside, he plays outside. I mean, that is going to make them, it's going to hurt them against Evans, it's going to hurt them against Godwin, it's going to hurt them against everybody. Of course, the problem here is the pass protection. Tampa Bay could be down to its 3rd string left tackle after their backup Josh Wells tore his patellar tendon. So that offensive line, which has been a problem since the onset for the Buccaneers, continues to be a problem against Brian Burns in this pass rush.
Last but not least, Joe, Deshaun Watson and the Browns against Carson Wentz and the Commanders. Wentz will get the start. We found that out this morning.
Yeah, he will start. I think it was trending in that way. The struggles of HB Heineke, hospital ball Heineke in the red zone, I think have finally led them to do that. Wentz came in after HB was benched in that game and played pretty well. And Carson Wentz is the Curtis Samuel whisperer. Samuel, who's done nothing for like 2 months, all of a sudden, Wentz comes into that game, and Curtis Samuel is out there scoring touchdowns. I mean, it's really kind of amazing. Remember in the first 3 weeks of the season, 8 catches, 7 catches, 7 catches for Samuel. And then with Heineke, he's had a 1 catch game. He's had a 0 catch game, 2 catch games. And then Wentz comes in and he scores his first touchdown since week 9. So Curtis Samuel, maybe if you're really dying, I think this is more of a DFS play. I don't know if I'd be brave enough to pick him up and start him in a redraft league, but he's a guy who can go out there and make an impact potentially this week. Now on the perimeter, I expect Denzel Ward to shadow Terry McLaurin. Number one, the thing that brings to mind is Jahan Dotson's a baller, and Jahan Dotson probably will be popular for DFS this week. But Terry McLaurin is a shadow killer. Most of the Commanders' opponents have chosen to follow him around with their top corner this year. In the 5 highest route share shadows of the season, 2 of them by Fabian Moreau, 1 each by Jair Alexander, Darius Slay, and Stephon Gilmore, McLaurin has caught at least four balls on his primary defender, totaling 25 catches for 382 yards and 2 touchdowns on 33 targets. He is the anti-Amari Cooper. If you shadow Terry McLaurin, he's going to win. It doesn't mean you won't have some good reps against him, but Terry McLaurin is going to win in a shadow, and I think Denzel Ward will shadow him this week.
What about Cleveland?
Ugh. I mean, last week, look, we know Watson's been terrible. We know that there was obviously significant rust. He was atrocious last week. There was also terrible weather in that game. The one thing that stands out to me is what happened to the Commanders last week, giving up 6 catches for 120 and 2 touchdowns to George Kittle. I think the number 1 receiver for the Browns this week is going to be David Njoku. And Amari Cooper, by the way, really struggles on the road. That's well pronounced. So maybe he's somebody you take out of your lineup this week. But I think David Njoku is going to be the number 1 receiver for the Browns in this game.
Interesting. That'll do it for episode 1 of the show that's so nice. We do it twice. We got the late games to get to. Niners, Raiders, Jets, Seahawks, Vikings, Packers among them. It'll be dropped in your podcast app shortly after midnight Thursday morning. I think we're done here.
Thanks for listening to the Fantasy Feast podcast. Make sure to also subscribe to the Ross Tucker Football Podcast, Even Money, Business of Sports, and the College Draft. All available at Apple Podcasts, rosstucker.com, or wherever podcasts can be found.